Have you ever heard knocking in the dead of night? Coming from a house you know is empty. What would you do if the sound didn't stop? If it grew louder, closer, and then you saw a figure standing in the dark, watching you? Tonight's story unravels a chilling mystery that begins with an innocent sound and spirals into something far more sinister. This isn't just about a neighbor's house. It's about what happens when curiosity pulls you to the edge of something you were never meant to see. Stay with me as we step into the quiet suburban street where the knocking began and where it may never stop. It started as an ordinary night, the kind of night that feels heavier than it should, thick with the sort of silence that makes you pay attention to your own breathing. The neighborhood seemed to be holding its breath too, the usual dog barks and car alarms absent. She sat curled on her couch, scrolling mindlessly through her phone, when a sound cracked through the stillness. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate, and hollow. She didn't move at first, convincing herself it was nothing. An animal maybe, or wood settling, but her heart had other plans. It thudded heavily, each beat louder than the last. She set her phone down, muted the television, and strained her ears. The sound didn't return immediately, but she couldn't shake the unease threading through her chest. There was something unnatural about it, almost as if it wasn't a random noise at all, but a signal, one meant to be heard. The thought lodged itself deeper when she remembered. The neighbors were gone. They had mentioned it in passing, waving over the fence 3 days prior, as they loaded suitcases into the trunk of their SUV. 2 weeks in Florida, they'd said. You'll have the whole block to yourself. At the time it sounded like a pleasant promise of peace and quiet. Now it felt like a curse, because no one should be in their house. No one should be making any sounds there. And yet, across the fence from the direction of their darkened porch, came 3 more knocks, this time louder, this time closer. She rose to her feet, the floorboards sighing under her weight. The air felt thicker somehow, as if it was pressing in on her, heavy and expectant. She padded barefoot to the window, tugging the curtain just enough to peer outside. The street lights cast their familiar orange glow across the cul-de-sac, stretching long shadows that looked too much like figures frozen mid-step. The neighbor's house sat in darkness. No porch light, no glow from within, only the faint outline of drawn curtains. She told herself to stop being ridiculous. It was probably a loose shutter or a swaying branch. But her eyes lingered on the upstairs window where, for just a fraction of a second, she thought she saw movement. A flutter of curtains, a shifting shadow. Her breath hitched. She closed the curtain and pressed her back to the wall, hands trembling slightly. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward midnight. She tried to focus on its rhythm, willing it to drown out the imagined sounds clawing at her senses. But then came the knocking again. 3 measured beats, now so loud she swore they came from the very walls of her own home. Panic flared as she turned toward her front door, half expecting it to rattle under unseen fists. But the house remained still. It was only when she leaned closer to the window that she understood. The sound wasn't in her home. It was across the lawn, echoing from the neighbor's house like a plea. She whispered to herself, voice trembling, "Why does it sound so close?" As if in reply, another knock came, this time followed by a soft, unmistakable scrape. Her phone lay abandoned on the couch, screen dark. She forced herself to pick it up, thumb hovering over the emergency call button. But she hesitated. What would she even say? That she heard knocking? That she thought she saw someone in her neighbor's supposedly empty house? It sounded insane even in her own head. She lowered the phone, pressing it to her chest like a lifeline, and debated her next move. Should she call them, her neighbors? But what good would it do? They were 1,000 miles away, probably enjoying drinks by a pool, while she stood trembling in her living room. Another knock resounded, followed by a faint whisper. She couldn't make out the words, but the sound of it, breathy, deliberate, made her skin crawl. She stepped back from the window, her pulse hammering. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe this was all just her mind playing tricks after too many sleepless nights and too much caffeine. But deep down, a primal instinct screamed at her that this was real. She couldn't shake the image of that fluttering curtain, or the sense that someone, was waiting across the fence. She thought about turning on every light in her house, maybe even the porch light. But the idea of illuminating herself felt like inviting it in, whatever it was. Instead, she slipped into the hallway, every creak of the floorboards magnified in the oppressive silence. She wanted to believe she was being cautious, but it felt more like prey, trying not to draw attention. As she reached her bedroom door, another sound joined the knocks, a dragging noise, long drawn out, like fingernails scraping across wood. It sent a shiver down her spine that rooted her in place. The noise didn't come from her house. She was sure of it now. It came from the neighbor's home, and worse, it seemed to be moving from the porch to the side of the house, closer to her own window. Her mind raced through every possibility. A squatter, a prankster, something less explainable. She pressed her back against the cold wall, heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. For the first time, she realized how fragile her thin walls and locked doors felt, as if they wouldn't stop whatever might come knocking next. She didn't sleep that night. Even after the knocking stopped, the silence felt alive, thick with unseen movement. Every creak of her house made her flinch. Every rustle outside sent her heart racing. The clock ticked past 3 a.m. before exhaustion finally pulled her under. But her dreams were uneasy, filled with soft tapping sounds and a pale face pressed against her window. When morning came, sunlight did little to shake the weight from her chest. She told herself that everything would feel different in daylight, that the sounds of birds and passing cars would wash away the unease clinging to her. But as she peered through her blinds, her stomach sank. Across the lawn, the neighbor's house still sat like a void, dark, shuttered, and silent. For hours she debated what to do. Should she call the police and report a possible intruder? Or was that overreacting? She opened the app on her phone to text her neighbor, but hesitated. How could she explain what happened without sounding unhinged? "Hey, I think someone's knocking in your house while you're away." The words seemed absurd on her screen. In the end, she sent nothing. Maybe it had been a one-off noise, easily explained by wind or settling wood. But deep down, she didn't believe it. Her memory replayed the sound over and over, 3 slow, measured knocks that felt too intentional. And then the whisper. She still couldn't shake how it had seemed to curl through the night air as though directed only at her. By late afternoon, she was still watching from her kitchen window. The neighbor's driveway remained empty. No signs of life, no mail collected, no lights flicked on. She told herself this was normal. They were on vacation after all. But she couldn't ignore the prickling sensation crawling over her skin whenever her gaze drifted to the upstairs window. She wanted to believe she imagined the faint movement she'd seen last night, that there hadn't really been a figure shifting behind the curtains. But her mind stubbornly replayed it, the way the fabric had trembled, like a hand had brushed it aside, like someone had been watching her watch them. And now, in the daylight, the curtains hung perfectly still, giving nothing away. Yet somehow that felt worse. By evening she had almost convinced herself she was being paranoid. She poured herself a glass of wine and turned on the television, trying to drown her thoughts in sitcom laughter. But just as the sun slipped below the horizon, the silence returned. It crept into her house like a living thing, pushing against the walls until even the sound of her own breathing seemed too loud. And then it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. She dropped her glass. It shattered across the floor, red liquid seeping between the tiles like spreading blood. Her breath caught as she turned toward the sound. It wasn't at her door. It wasn't even from her own walls. It came from across the lawn, from the neighbor's house. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. This time she wasn't imagining it. This time the sound was louder, heavier, like someone was standing right there on the other side of their door, pounding with steady insistence. She pressed her phone to her ear and dialed 911, her voice low and shaking as she whispered her address. But the call didn't connect. Only static hissed in her ear. She hung up and tried again. Static again. Static. She stood frozen in her kitchen, staring out the window. Darkness had swallowed the street now. The neighbor's house looked the same as ever, empty still, but the knocking didn't stop. It came again and again, and then, impossibly, she heard the faint sound of a voice drifting through the night air. Words she couldn't quite catch, muffled and broken. Her heart raced. It sounded like a plea or a warning. She didn't know which. She couldn't help herself. Grabbing a flashlight, she moved to her front door, fingers brushing the lock. She peered through the peephole first. Nothing but her own empty yard. The knocking continued, not at her door, never at her door, but from across the way. She unlocked the door and stepped outside. The cool air hit her skin like ice. She strained her eyes toward the neighbor's house, but its windows stared back blankly. No sign of movement within. Her voice felt small in the stillness. There was no answer, only silence. And then, as she watched, the upstairs curtain fluttered again. The curtain moved again. Not a flutter this time, but a slow, deliberate shift, as though someone inside was dragging their fingers along the fabric. She froze, barely breathing, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam cut a pale slice across the neighbor's lawn, but couldn't penetrate the shadows pooling around their house. For a moment, she swore she saw something pressed against the upstairs glass, a pale oval, vaguely the shape of a face. Her heart slammed against her ribs, so hard it felt like it might burst. She stumbled back a step, her slipper catching on the concrete porch. The sound of her own foot scuffing the ground startled her as much as any scream would have. She couldn't look away from that window. Even as the curtains stilled again, the image burned into her mind. Hollow eyes, an expression that wasn't quite human. She whispered to herself, almost as though saying it aloud would force it to be true. It's just a trick of the light, just my imagination. But her voice cracked on the last word. The wind shifted, and in its wake came a sound that made her knees weaken. The knocking had started again. Not 3 beats this time, but 5, slow, irregular, as though whoever was knocking had lost the rhythm. Or maybe they didn't care anymore. She turned and bolted for her door, fumbling with the handle. Inside, she slammed the lock into place, pressed her back against the wood, and tried to steady her breathing. The knocking continued across the lawn, loud and insistent, each strike reverberating through her like an echo in her bones. She didn't call the police again. She didn't even pick up her phone. The static from earlier still hissed in her ears, and some deep part of her feared hearing that sound again, more than the knocking. She crouched low beneath the front window, holding her breath. From here, she couldn't see the neighbor's house anymore, but the sound of the knocks painted a vivid picture in her mind. Someone standing at their door, pounding slowly, endlessly, a rhythm that felt less like a request to come in and more like a demand. She pressed her hands to her ears and shut her eyes tight, whispering, "Please, stop." But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder. By 3:12 a.m., the sound shifted. It was subtle at first, but her senses had been sharpened to every noise, every vibration. The knocks were no longer coming from the front of the neighbor's house. They had moved. Now they echoed faintly from the side, closer to the fence that separated their properties, closer to her own house. She pressed her face to the floor, peering through the gap at the bottom of her curtains. The neighbor's lawn was empty, their porch dark, but something felt wrong, like the darkness itself had shifted. She swore she saw a shadow where there shouldn't be one, long and thin, stretched impossibly across the grass, as though someone stood just out of sight. When the knocking stopped, the silence was somehow worse. It wasn't relief she felt, but anticipation, dread curling like smoke in her chest. Then came the dragging sound again, louder now. It scraped across wood, across concrete, across the thin fence between their yards. Her flashlight lay useless on the coffee table. She didn't dare reach for it. Her breath came fast and shallow. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, but something stronger, something darker, whispered that hiding wouldn't matter. She wasn't the only one listening tonight. As if to confirm her fear, there came a sound that turned her blood to ice. A faint tap, light, almost gentle on her own window. It was so soft she wouldn't have heard it, if not for the suffocating silence that had settled over her house. Another tap followed, then another, a slow, deliberate rhythm. Her stomach knotted. She wanted to move, to run, but her body refused. Her muscles felt leaden, her limbs heavy as stone. Then, without thinking, she lifted her eyes toward the window. For just a heartbeat, she saw it, a face in the glass. The face at the window was gone. So quickly she almost doubted she'd seen it. But the image burned into her mind, refused to fade. Skin pale as wax, eyes sunken and unblinking, mouth stretched in a way that spoke of neither smile nor frown, but something far more unnatural. She stumbled backward, heart hammering in her chest so violently it hurt. She pressed her hands to her mouth to stifle a scream. The tapping began again. Faster now, a series of light, frantic knocks that skittered like fingernails across glass. She scrambled to her bedroom, shutting the door and pressing her weight against it, as if the thin wood could hold back whatever waited outside. For a moment, there was silence. No tapping, no dragging, no sound at all. She almost let herself believe it had ended. Then came a noise that tore the breath from her lungs. 3 slow knocks, this time on her bedroom window. They were impossibly loud, each one reverberating like a drumbeat in her skull. She clapped her hands over her ears, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Please go away," she whispered, rocking slightly on the floor. Another knock answered her plea, followed by the faintest hint of a whisper, so soft she couldn't make out the words. But the tone sent a cold shiver down her spine. It was coaxing, patient, almost tender. She wanted to call for help, but her phone was still on the couch. She'd have to cross the living room, past the very window where that thing had been watching. Her legs felt like they were filled with sand as she forced herself up. She clutched the doorknob, every muscle tense. and inched the door open. The hallway beyond was dark, the air thick and heavy. She crept forward, each step agonizingly slow. As she neared the living room, she froze. The tapping had stopped. In its place came another sound, a soft, steady breathing. It wasn't hers. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was in her house. She pressed her back to the wall, clutching her chest to keep her heartbeat from exploding out loud. The breathing grew louder, then softer, as if whatever it belonged to was wandering, searching. She shut her eyes, biting her lip to keep from sobbing. For a moment, she considered making a break for the door, but then the whisper came again, so close it felt as if it brushed the back of her neck. "Let me in," she bolted. Not for the door, but for her bedroom again. She slammed it shut and shoved her dresser against it. Her lungs burned as she sank to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She didn't know how long she sat there in the dark. Minutes, hours, time lost all meaning. At some point, the house fell silent. Not a sound from outside, not a sound within. The quiet was suffocating, and yet she didn't dare move. As the first light of dawn crept through her curtains, exhaustion finally claimed her. She drifted into a restless sleep, though the whispers followed her even there. When she woke hours later, the house felt the same, still, oppressive, wrong. She dared a glance outside. The neighbor's house remained silent, its windows blank eyes staring back at her. But on her own porch lay something that hadn't been there before, a folded piece of paper. She stared at it from her bedroom window for what felt like forever before summoning the courage to retrieve it. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, almost childlike. "You saw me, now I see you." Morning light did nothing to erase the night's terror. If anything, it made the events feel even more impossible, like they'd taken place in a world just slightly removed from her own. But the paper still sat on her kitchen table, its jagged scrawl etched deep into her mind. "Now I see you." She stared at it with a hollow feeling in her chest, her coffee growing cold in her hands. She told herself to throw it away, to burn it even, but some instinct kept her from touching it again. She couldn't shake the feeling that moving it might invite something back. Maybe it already had. Every time she passed a window, she felt eyes on her, a heavy gaze pressing from the shadows. But when she looked, there was nothing there, just empty street, swaying trees, and the lifeless face of the neighbor's house, staring back at her. She didn't go outside that day. She didn't even open the blinds. Her phone had been dead when she woke, and no matter how many times she tried to charge it, the screen stayed black. She told herself it was just a technical issue, nothing more, but deep down, she knew better. The memory of that whisper still curled in her ears, its cadence unnatural, too precise. "Let me in." It hadn't sounded angry or impatient. That was what unsettled her most. It had sounded patient, as though whatever it was had all the time in the world, as though it knew she would cave, eventually. By late afternoon, the silence had grown unbearable. She tried turning on the TV, but the screen flickered with static, filling the room with a harsh hiss that made her stomach twist. She turned it off and sat in the quiet again, listening for any sound outside. Hours passed, then just as the sun began to dip below the rooftops, she heard it, the knocking. This time it was softer, almost tentative. 3 slow taps against glass. She froze mid-step in her hallway, every muscle locking tight. The sound came again, 3 knocks, then silence. She turned toward the sound, heart hammering against her ribs. It wasn't coming from her door or her walls. It was at the kitchen window. She stood rooted in place, staring down the hall toward the dim outline of the window. She couldn't see anyone, but she didn't need to. She felt it, the weight of eyes watching her from just beyond the glass. The knocks came again, louder now, sharper. She took a step back, her foot catching on the hallway rug. The sound stopped. A breathless moment passed. Then came a new sound, a slow scrape, like fingernails dragging across wood. It circled her house, moving from one window to the next. She pressed a hand to her mouth, muffling a sob. She wanted to call for help, to scream, but she couldn't make a sound. Her throat felt closed, her chest tight. As the scraping moved toward the living room, she darted for her bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. She huddled on the floor, arms wrapped tight around her knees. Hours seemed to stretch on endlessly, the scraping sound fading in and out, like waves lapping at a shore. At some point, her exhaustion overtook her fear, and she drifted into a fitful sleep. When she woke to sunlight filtering through her curtains, her first thought was relief. But then she noticed her bedroom window, written in the fog on the glass, as though traced by a finger, were the words, "Let me see." She didn't dare touch the window. The words stared back at her like an accusation, each letter slightly smudged where the condensation had begun to fade. "Let me see." Her breath fogged the glass as she leaned closer, and for a split second, she imagined a face waiting just beyond, close enough to feel her presence, close enough to trace those words while she slept. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of her bed, and pressed herself to the opposite wall. Her body felt numb, her mind struggling to keep pace with the rising panic. This wasn't random. It wasn't a squatter or a prank. Whatever it was, it knew she was here. It had been in her yard, at her window, watching her sleep. The hours that followed were a blur. She pulled every curtain shut, locked every door twice, and dragged furniture in front of the windows like makeshift barricades. The sunlight offered no comfort. If anything, it felt like a thin veil, too easily ripped away when night returned. She thought about calling someone, anyone, but her phone remained lifeless, despite hours on the charger. The silence from the outside world felt deliberate now, as though she'd been cut off, stranded in this house with nothing but her own fear. She tried the TV again, only to be greeted by static that pulsed faintly in time with her heartbeat. The sound was hypnotic, almost whispering underneath the hiss, and she snapped it off before her imagination could take hold. By nightfall, the silence had thickened, pressing against the walls like an unseen tide. She tried to sleep in the living room, flashlight gripped tight in her hand, but every creak of the house jolted her awake. The first knock came just after midnight. This time it wasn't on the neighbor's house. It wasn't even on her windows. It was on her back door. 3 slow, deliberate strikes. She held her breath, gripping the flashlight so hard her knuckles ached. The knocks came again, louder this time. Then a pause, then the faint sound of the doorknob rattling gently. Testing, her stomach turned to ice. She wanted to scream, but fear clamped her throat shut. Instead, she crawled across the floor, heart hammering in her ears, and pressed herself against the kitchen wall. The rattling stopped. Silence fell so suddenly it felt like the air had been sucked out of the house. And then, impossibly, she heard footsteps. Soft, dragging steps moving across her porch. They circled her house slowly, almost lazily, as though whoever or whatever was out there knew she could hear. When the footsteps stopped, she didn't dare move. Hours passed in suffocating stillness, her back aching against the cold floor. She must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing she knew, faint light crept in through the cracks of her barricaded curtains. Her body felt stiff, her mind fogged with exhaustion. She pulled herself up and peered out through the smallest gap in the curtain. The yard was empty, the street still, but something caught her eye on the porch. A new note. She didn't want to open the door. She didn't even want to touch the handle, but she had to know. With shaking hands, she cracked the door just enough to reach out and snatch the paper. The handwriting was the same jagged scrawl. "You're already mine." Her hands trembled so violently, she almost dropped the note. She stumbled back, slamming the door and throwing the deadbolt. She pressed her forehead against the wood, trying to breathe. But no matter how many times she inhaled, the air felt too thin. It wasn't just knocking anymore, it was a claim. She didn't remember falling asleep, but when her eyes opened, it was already dark again. Dread settled over her chest, like a weight the moment she saw the faint glow of the clock. 11:48 p.m. Almost midnight. Her heart quickened, as though it knew what was coming. She sat perfectly still on the living room floor, gripping the flashlight, eyes darting between the barricaded windows. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet where even breathing felt like a disturbance. She forced herself to stand and moved cautiously toward the kitchen, hunger gnawing faintly at her stomach, though fear still outweighed any need for food. As she passed the hallway, she thought she heard something softer than footsteps, but rhythmic, like faint tapping on glass. She froze mid-step, her hand gripping the wall for balance. The sound was so faint, it might have been her imagination. But then it came again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not on the back door this time, not on the kitchen window. This time, it was from the living room, from the very window she had barricaded hours ago. Her body went rigid. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. She could almost feel it now, something standing on the other side of the glass, tall and still, its face inches away, waiting for her to look. The knocking stopped. Silence filled the house again, so thick it roared in her ears. Then came a whisper, muffled but close, as if spoken directly into the glass. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent a chill crawling up her spine. It was low, coaxing, almost affectionate. She clapped her hands over her ears, retreating into the hallway as her pulse thundered in her temples. She shut herself in the bathroom, locking the door, even though a thin lock would do nothing, against whatever might come for her. She slumped to the floor, hugging her knees to her chest. She didn't know how long she sat there. Minutes, hours, it didn't matter. The sound of faint dragging, like long fingers brushing against wood, passed along the bathroom wall. She held her breath until her lungs burned, praying it would move on. At last, the sound faded. But even then, she didn't move. She stayed curled on the cold tile until her muscles ached from tension. It wasn't until she heard birds chirping faintly outside that she realized dawn had arrived. When she finally emerged from the bathroom, she crept through her house as if it were unfamiliar, alien. The barricades at her windows were untouched. The doors were still locked, but something in the air felt different, heavier, as though she'd already let it in without knowing it. She pressed her forehead to the kitchen window and peered outside. The neighbor's house stared back, its curtains unmoving, its porch empty. But her eyes caught on a new detail. In the center of her own lawn lay another note. This one was larger than the others. The paper curled slightly at the edges from dew. She didn't want to go outside, but some deep part of her whispered that if she didn't, things would only get worse. With trembling hands, she unlocked her door and stepped out. The air felt colder than it should, sharp against her bare skin. She snatched up the note and ran back inside, bolting the door behind her. The scrawl was larger this time, more erratic, as if written in haste or excitement. "You can't hide, I'm already inside." She dropped the note as though it had burned her fingers. Her eyes darted around her home, each shadow deeper than the last, each creak of the walls like a breath from something unseen. She wasn't alone. She knew it now. She backed away from the note, every nerve in her body screaming. Her eyes darted to the hallway, then to the shadows gathering in the corners of the living room. It felt wrong. Her own house felt wrong. She tried to steady her breathing, but each inhale seemed too loud, too risky. If it was already inside, where was it hiding? She forced her mind to focus. She checked the locks. She checked every window. But maybe she'd missed something. Maybe it didn't need an open door to get in. The thought made her stomach churn. She grabbed her flashlight and moved cautiously through the house, flipping on lights in every room, even though the weak bulbs did little to chase away the oppressive dark. Each creak of the floor beneath her feet set her heart pounding. The hallway seemed longer than usual, the shadows stretching impossibly far ahead of her. She checked the guest room first. Empty, then the bathroom, silent. She turned toward her bedroom last, the door half open, a thin sliver of darkness spilling into the hall. She hadn't left it that way. Her fingers tightened on the flashlight, and she nudged the door open with the tip of her foot. The room was still, the bed untouched. But then her beam caught on something, faint, almost invisible. A smudge on the inside of her window. A fingerprint. No, 5 of them, long and thin, streaking down the glass, as though someone had pressed their hand there and dragged it slowly downward. Her breath caught in her throat. She staggered back into the hall, nearly tripping over her own feet. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to get out, but her legs wouldn't move. She pressed her back to the wall, tears welling in her eyes. That handprint hadn't been there yesterday. It hadn't been there this morning, which meant someone, no, something, had been in her room while she slept. The weight of that realization was suffocating. She stumbled back toward the living room, heart racing. She needed air. She needed to think. But as she reached the front door, she heard it. Breathing. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. Then louder, closer. Slow, deliberate inhales and exhales, as though someone was standing inches away from her face. She whirled around, flashlight beams sweeping wildly across the room. Nothing, but the sound continued, growing so loud she could feel it vibrating in her chest. She clamped her hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut. "Stop," she whispered. "Please stop." But the breathing didn't stop. It shifted, moving behind her, then to her left, then directly in front of her. She felt cold air brush her cheek, and a voice low and guttural spoke into her ear. "See me," she screamed, dropping the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, its beam spinning wildly and throwing monstrous shapes on the walls. She bolted for the door, fumbling with the locks. Her fingers felt clumsy. the metal slick with sweat. She wrenched the door open and stumbled out into the night. The air was sharp and biting, but she didn't care. She ran barefoot across the lawn, not stopping until she reached the middle of the street. She turned back toward her house, chest heaving. The windows were all dark, except one. Her bedroom. A figure stood there, barely visible against the glass. Tall, thin, its face pressed to the window, pale and featureless, except for hollow, endless eyes. It didn't move. It didn't need to. She felt its gaze reach her even from across the street, rooting her to the spot. And then slowly, its hand rose. It tapped once on the glass, then again and again. She stood in the middle of the street, barefoot, trembling, her breath puffing white in the cold night air. The figure remained motionless in her bedroom window, its pale face pressed flat against the glass, staring down at her with hollow, unblinking eyes. She wanted to tell herself it wasn't real, that it was a reflection, a trick of exhaustion, a shadow shaped cruelly by her fear. But deep down she knew it had been waiting for her to run, waiting for her to notice it fully. Now that she had, its gaze felt like an anchor around her ribs, heavy and suffocating. Her chest tightened with every passing second. She couldn't move. Her legs felt like lead. Her mouth was dry. The street was empty. No cars, no neighbors stepping out for late walks. Not even the sound of distant traffic. It was as if the world itself had been drained of life. She forced her feet back a step, her heels scraping the asphalt. The figure didn't move, but then it raised a long, thin hand and pressed it flat against the glass. Her stomach turned cold. Slowly, its fingers began to tap. 1, 2, 3, deliberate and rhythmic. The sound carried far too clearly across the still air, echoing faintly as if the glass itself were inside her own skull. She flinched with every beat. She knew if she stayed frozen much longer, she would never break free. Her body lurched backward on instinct, her feet clumsy and unsteady on the rough road. The asphalt dug into her skin, sending sharp jolts of pain through her soles. It was the only thing reminding her she was still alive, still able to move. She turned sharply and ran, her lungs sucking in cold night air that felt like knives against her throat. Her house vanished behind her with every stride, but she couldn't shake the sensation that those hollow eyes followed her still, boring into her back with impossible precision. Her mind screamed to find a light, a person, a car, anything alive in this empty suburban street. But there was nothing. Every home she passed seemed wrong, their windows black like dead eyes, blinds drawn tight like lips, refusing to speak. She didn't slow, not even when her chest burned. The sound of her own footsteps became deafening, yet beneath them she swore she heard something else, a faint echo. Tap, 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 not behind her, not in front, but all around, as though the sound didn't come from a single place anymore, but from the night itself, wrapping her in a circle of dread. She wanted to scream for help, but feared the sound of her voice would draw it nearer. She didn't know how far she ran before her legs gave out. She collapsed hard on the curb outside a house 3 streets away, knees pulled tight to her chest. Her breathing came in jagged, uneven gasps that fogged the air. The night was so still, it felt as though the world was holding its breath with her. She dared a glance back the way she had come, her neck stiff and reluctant to turn. The road stretched empty beneath flickering streetlights, but at the far end, just within the weak yellow glow, she saw it, a shape, Too tall, too thin, perfectly still. Her stomach turned to ice. She blinked hard, hoping it would vanish when she opened her eyes again. But it remained, a dark silhouette against the trembling light, its outline unnatural in a way her mind couldn't fully process. It wasn't moving, but she felt certain it was watching her. The certainty was crushing. It didn't need to chase her. It didn't even need to step closer. Somehow, she knew it could reach her wherever she went. She pressed her face into her knees, tears stinging her eyes as her body shook. She tried to convince herself it was all a mistake, a nightmare bleeding into waking life. But her skin felt too raw, her feet too torn and aching from the asphalt to be dreaming. She curled tighter, wishing she could vanish into the concrete beneath her. For a moment all was still, but then softly, almost imperceptibly, she heard it again. Breathing, slow, deliberate, too close. Her hands clamped over her ears, but the sound was inside her head, now echoing in the deepest parts of her mind. She felt it on her skin, a cold exhale brushing her cheek. Her stomach lurched with the unbearable certainty that it was standing right behind her. Its head bent low to her ear. She wanted to move, to scream, to run, but she couldn't. She was a marionette with her strings cut, helpless and small beneath its unseen weight. Then the whisper came, "See me." The words weren't loud, but they rippled through her body like a stone dropped into still water. She jerked her head up, eyes wide, breath coming in ragged pulls. The shape under the distant streetlight was gone. But her relief turned to terror when she felt it. Fingers, long and impossibly cold, brushing against her bare shoulder. She screamed and flung herself forward, tumbling into the street. Her knees scraped against the asphalt, and her hands stung as she pushed herself up. She ran again, this time with no sense of direction, no plan, no thought beyond escape. The sound of breathing seemed to follow her, just beyond the reach of her ears, close enough to feel but never see. Her feet carried her blindly until she stumbled against a chain-link fence. She gripped the cold metal, gasping, her chest heaving so hard it hurt. She blinked through tears and realized she was at the edge of the neighborhood. Beyond the fence lay a stretch of woods, thick and black and whispering with unseen movement. She didn't want to enter, but behind her stretched the same silent street, the same empty windows that now felt more dangerous than the dark trees. She squeezed through a gap in the fence, branches clawing at her skin as she pushed forward into the underbrush. The woods were deathly quiet. Even the wind seemed to avoid them. She didn't stop moving, but the thought gnawed at her mind with every step. What if this was where it wanted her to go? Somewhere deep in the darkness, she heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Not on wood, not on glass, but on her skull, inside her mind. The forest swallowed her whole. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself was resisting her passage. Branches clawed at her arms, snapping across her face like thin whips, leaving angry red trails on her skin. The air smelled wrong, damp and metallic, tinged with a sweetness that made her stomach churn. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, each one louder than she wanted it to be in the crushing silence of the trees. Behind her, the faint tapping hadn't stopped. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't distant anymore. It was close. Too close. She couldn't tell if the sound was real or a phantom echo in her mind, but it was steady, deliberate, mocking. She stumbled over a root and caught herself against the rough bark of a tree, her palms raw from the impact. Somewhere in the dark ahead, something shifted. A subtle crackle of leaves, like footsteps barely grazing the forest floor. She froze, her eyes darting wildly between the trees. The shapes around her seemed to move, even when she wasn't looking, twisting subtly, bending as if to make room for something passing unseen. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out any other sound. She pressed herself to the tree, willing herself smaller, quieter. But the tapping began again, louder now. It wasn't on the trees, it wasn't on the ground, it was in her head. A steady rhythm beating against her skull from the inside. Her nails dug into the bark, splinters biting under her skin, but she didn't notice. All she could focus on was the sound. Tap, 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 and then another whisper. Closer this time. You can't run. The voice didn't echo like a normal sound. It bloomed directly in her thoughts, curling around her mind like smoke. Her knees gave out, and she collapsed against the roots, tears blurring her vision. The whisper came again, softer now, almost tender. You'll see me soon. She shook her head violently, clutching her temples, as if she could claw the sound out. But it only laughed, a low guttural sound vibrating inside her ribcage. Desperate to move, she forced herself back to her feet, legs trembling violently. She stumbled forward, each step an act of sheer will. The trees felt tighter here, their trunks leaning inward, as though conspiring to trap her. Every shadow seemed alive, writhing in the edges of her vision. She didn't dare look behind her, terrified of what she might find. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the faint glow ahead, a thin sliver of moonlight breaking through the canopy. She pushed toward it, branches snapping underfoot, her breaths ragged and shallow. The whisper followed, never louder, but never fading. You're almost there, it said with a strange calmness, like a parent coaxing a frightened child. Just a little closer. She shook her head, muttering no, under her breath, like a mantra. But her body moved anyway, drawn inexorably toward the light. When she broke into the clearing, her knees nearly buckled with relief. Moonlight spilled across the forest floor, illuminating the space like a pale spotlight. She stumbled to the center, hugging herself, as if to hold her shaking body together. For the first time in what felt like hours, the tapping had stopped. The silence pressed hard against her ears, but she welcomed it. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed to the ground, staring up at the thin slice of moon. Her chest heaved as tears streaked hot down her face. She thought she might finally be safe, until she noticed the ground beneath her. Carved into the dirt in a jagged, uneven scrawl were words that hadn't been there moments ago. I see you. She scrambled backward, her hands clawing at the earth for purchase. Her eyes darted wildly around the clearing, but it was empty, or so she thought. Then she saw it, barely discernible at the tree line. A figure, tall, thin, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, its arms hanging limply like a marionette with cut strings. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't move, but she felt its eyes on her, drilling into her from across the clearing. Slowly, painfully slowly, it raised one impossibly long arm and pointed directly at her. She couldn't scream, she couldn't even breathe. The forest seemed to close in, the air thickening until it felt like she was drowning in it. Her vision swam, dark spots creeping into the edges of her sight. She forced herself to her feet, stumbling backward until her shoulder slammed into a tree trunk. Pain shot through her arm, but she welcomed it. It meant she was still in her body, still real. The figure hadn't moved, but the air vibrated with its presence. It didn't need to advance. It was already here, pressing in from every side. She bolted, darting back into the trees, branches tearing at her skin as she ran. Her lungs burned with each ragged breath, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The whisper followed, soft and lilting. No more running. It's time to see. Her pulse roared in her ears, drowning out everything but her own terror. The forest twisted around her, every tree looking the same, every path turning her back toward the clearing. No matter how many times she changed direction, panic clawed at her chest, tightening until it hurt to breathe. She tripped over a root and fell hard, her hands sinking into cold, wet earth. When she looked up, her stomach dropped. She was back in the clearing. The carved words in the dirt had changed. "Now I see you too." And across the clearing, the figure had stepped closer. She didn't know how it had moved so fast. One moment, the figure had been at the edge of the clearing, a silent sentinel watching from the shadows. Now it stood only feet away, tall and grotesquely thin, its elongated arms dangling loosely at its sides. The moonlight caught on its face, or where a face should have been. There were no features, just a pale, smooth surface broken only by two deep, endless hollows where eyes should reside. Her body locked in place. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to scream, to fight, but her muscles refused to respond. She felt as though invisible hands had wrapped around her limbs, holding her in place as the thing tilted its head in an almost curious gesture. The air vibrated with its presence, heavy and electric, each breath she took tasting metallic. Its head jerked sharply to the left, then the right, with the unnatural twitch of a puppet on strings. Then came the sound, the tapping, not with fingers this time, louder, deeper, as though something massive was knocking inside her skull, trying to get out. Tap, tap, tap. Her vision blurred as her knees buckled, dropping her to the cold dirt. The whispers returned, softer than before, but infinitely more invasive, slipping past her ears straight into her mind. So close now, it said, with an almost tender lilt. "You've run enough. Let me show you." She shook her head violently, clawing at her own ears as if she could rip the sound out. But the voice only deepened, becoming layered, echoing from every direction in the clearing and from within her own chest. "See, see, see." The last word seemed to lodge itself behind her eyes, and she squeezed them shut. But in the darkness behind her lids, shapes twisted and writhed, long fingers reaching, a mouth stretching impossibly wide in a silent scream. Her stomach heaved, bile rising in her throat, as a cold hand brushed her face. Her eyes flew open, but the figure was no longer there. The clearing was empty, too empty. Even the carved words in the dirt had vanished. She scrambled to her feet, staggering backward, until her spine pressed against the rough bark of a tree. Her heart slammed against her ribs, so hard it felt like it would crack bone. The forest was silent again, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature. It was the oppressive, calculated stillness of something holding its breath. She took a shaky step toward the tree line, then another, her bare feet sliding in the damp earth. Every inch of her screamed, not to look back, but she couldn't help herself. Slowly she turned her head, and there it was, less than a foot away. It hadn't moved, it had simply become closer, as if the space between them no longer obeyed the rules of distance. Its hollow eyes bore into her, and for a moment she thought she saw something in their depths, a reflection of herself, small and trembling, trapped inside those endless pits. She gasped as the world tilted violently. The forest spun around her, trees warping and twisting like molten wax. She stumbled, clutching her head, as pain exploded behind her eyes. Her vision swam with flashes, her kitchen, her bedroom, the neighbor's house, all empty, all wrong. The windows gaped like open mouths, and in each one she saw the figure's pale face staring back. She felt herself falling, though her feet were still planted firmly on the ground. The clearing dissolved around her, replaced by her living room. She was home, or something that looked like home, but everything was off. The walls pulsed faintly, as though breathing. The lights flickered, casting long, clawed shadows that seemed to shift, even when she stayed still. She stumbled backward, her hand brushing against her couch. It felt damp, sticky. She yanked her hand away and looked down, heart lurching. Her palm was smeared with a dark, oily substance that glistened like tar. Her breath caught in her throat as she heard it again, knocking, this time not from outside, but from inside the walls themselves. The sound surrounded her, coming from all directions at once. Tap, tap, tap. She spun wildly, searching for the source. The whispers returned, louder now, voices overlapping, until they became an incoherent chorus. "You're home. Let me in. Let me see. Let me see." She stumbled toward the front door, gripping the handle with slick, trembling fingers, but it wouldn't turn. She twisted harder, but the metal seemed fused in place. A chill spread from the knob into her hand, seeping through her skin and into her bones. She yelped and released it, backing away. Her eyes darted to the hallway, just as a shadow peeled itself from the wall. The figure stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate. She bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time, her knees threatening to give out with every step. She slammed her bedroom door shut and pressed her weight against it. The knocking began again, this time on the other side. 3 slow, deliberate taps. She clamped her hands over her mouth to stifle her sobs as the voice spoke from behind the wood, low and coaxing. "You've always seen me, you just didn't know." Her body shook violently, tears streaming hot down her cheeks. She wanted to block it out, to cover her ears, but she couldn't move. The voice was inside her head, now, whispering behind her eyes. "I've been waiting in the quiet, waiting in the dark. You opened the door the moment you noticed me." The knocking grew faster, harder. The wood rattled as though about to splinter. She screamed, pressing herself against the far wall. But even as she did, a cold breath touched her neck. The whisper slid directly into her ear. "Now, let's see each other properly." She woke to darkness so complete, it felt suffocating, her lungs straining, as though the air itself had thickened around her. The cold bit deep into her skin, far sharper than the night air had been outside. For a long, agonizing moment, she couldn't tell where she was. Then the smell hit her, damp earth, mold, and something faintly metallic, like rust or old blood. Her fingers clawed at the ground beneath her, encountering cold stone slick with moisture. She pushed herself up slowly, her head pounding with a dull, rhythmic throb. Tap! She froze as the sound grew louder, not from outside, but from deep within her skull, echoing as though her own heartbeat had been replaced by it. She forced her eyes open, and in the faintest glow, moonlight seeping through cracks far above, she saw it, the figure, not standing this time, hanging, its pale, elongated body suspended upside down from the ceiling, like a grotesque spider, its head craned toward her, featureless but somehow still staring. She couldn't look away. She didn't dare. The figure's limbs twitched slightly, long fingers flexing, as though testing invisible threads. Then, with slow deliberation, it began to descend. Its body remained perfectly still as it lowered, the motion utterly silent, except for a faint creaking from above. She pressed herself back against the wall, her fingernails scraping at the stone behind her. Her breath came in sharp, shallow bursts that fogged in the cold air. "Don't," she whispered, though her voice was barely a sound at all. The thing paused, its head tilting sharply to one side, then the other, as if listening to her tiny protest. For a terrible moment, she thought it might retreat, but then it continued its descent, coming to rest just inches above the floor. Its head twitched again, closer now. She could almost feel the cold emanating from its pale skin. She closed her eyes, praying she'd wake up, but the voice slid smoothly into her thoughts. "No more running. You see me now, and I see all of you." Her eyes snapped open, and for the first time, she saw what lay beyond the figure. The walls weren't stone, not entirely. They were covered in faces. Faint impressions of screaming mouths and wide, horrified eyes, all frozen in a moment of silent terror. Her stomach lurched violently as she stumbled backward, hands tiny, frail, pressed out from the wall toward her, stretching the surface like thin fabric. She clamped both hands over her mouth to stifle her scream, but the figure's head turned, following her movements with unnatural precision. "You've joined them already," it whispered, not aloud, but deep inside her, where no sound should exist. "Your door was open long before you heard the knock." Its hand reached for her then, long skeletal fingers uncurling inch by inch, until they hovered before her face. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even blink. The tips of its fingers brushed her cheek with a cold so sharp it felt like burning. Pain flared violently in her head as a flood of images poured in. Her standing at her window as a child, peering into the darkened neighbor's house, seeing movement in the glass. Her hands opening doors she didn't remember unlocking. Night after night of restless sleep as a pale face watched from the shadows. It had been with her all along, she realized, not just waiting, but growing, feeding. Its voice deepened, becoming layered, a chorus of voices overlapping in her skull. "We never leave, we never knock." You opened. The hands in the walls pressed out harder, their faint moans rising in pitch until they became a chorus of whispers, crying her name in unison. She pressed her palms to her ears, sobbing, but the sound only grew louder. Desperately, she lunged for the faint sliver of moonlight overhead. Her hands clawed at the slick stone walls, tearing her skin as she tried to pull herself up. But the surface offered no grip, and her nails snapped against the unyielding rock. Behind her, the figure's fingers curled slowly into a fist. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was deafening now, shaking her skull like a drumbeat. She cried out as the air thickened further, pressing down on her, until it felt like she was being buried alive. "One last knock," the voice whispered, low and final. "For you." Its hand shot forward and grasped her ankle. The cold spread instantly, searing up her leg like liquid ice. Her scream broke into jagged sobs as she was yanked violently back toward the center of the room. Her nails scraped uselessly at the stone, her legs kicking wildly, but the grip only tightened. The figure loomed over her now, its head tilting slowly until it was upside down, level with hers. In the faint light, she thought she saw something ripple across its smooth face, like a mouth forming, stretching impossibly wide. Its whisper came again, soft but final. "Now we knock together." The last thing she felt was a sharp pressure in her skull, then nothing at all. She woke, to silence. Not the kind of silence that comes with peace, but the heavy, unnatural stillness of a place where sound has been devoured entirely. Her eyes fluttered open to a ceiling she didn't recognize. It was smooth and pale, almost fleshy, with faint veins running beneath its surface like thin blue threads. She blinked slowly, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Her body felt heavy, leaden, as though invisible hands pinned her to the floor. When she tried to move, her limbs refused. Panic flared in her chest as she realized she couldn't even feel her own fingers. A faint sound stirred somewhere in the distance. Not a knock this time. Breathing, deep, slow, and inhumanly steady. She tried to turn her head toward it, but her neck wouldn't obey. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw them. The faces, hundreds of them, pressed into the walls around her, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide and glassy. Some wept, others stared blankly, but all of them seemed to watch her, their attention as heavy as the air pressing on her chest. Her stomach churned violently. A whisper slid into her mind like a blade. Awake again. The voice wasn't loud, but it pulsed through her skull, vibrating her bones. You always wake. That's what makes you so interesting. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but no sound came from her throat. Even her breathing felt shallow, barely enough to keep her conscious. The voice chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to reverberate from every direction at once. Do you know where you are? She didn't, but deep down, some part of her understood. This was beneath everything. Beneath her house, beneath her town, beneath her own skin. The place where all the knocking leads. You came to me, it whispered, again and again. A child peeking through windows. A woman hearing sounds in the walls. Each time you opened the door a little wider. She shook her head weakly, but the whisper only grew closer. You don't remember because I let you forget. It's easier that way. But now, it paused. Now you've come too far to go back. Her body jerked violently. A sensation returned in a sudden rush. Her fingers twitched. Her chest heaved painfully as air flooded her lungs. She gasped, curling onto her side on the soft, spongy floor. The faces in the walls groaned faintly, a sound like wind whistling through cracked glass. She pushed herself to her knees, her palms sinking slightly into the pliant surface beneath her. It felt alive, pulsing faintly with a slow, rhythmic beat. Tap, tap, tap. She scrambled to her feet, every nerve screaming to get away from the walls that seemed to shift and breathe with her movements. Where are you going? The voice teased. There is nowhere to run. She ignored it, forcing her legs to move, stumbling toward what looked like a hallway. The faces followed her, their eyes tracking her every step. One of them whispered faintly as she passed, "Don't leave. It's worse outside." Her pace quickened despite the warning. The hallway stretched endlessly, its walls slick and warm, the faint glow of veins lighting her way. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Each step echoed faintly, though there was no floor to strike, only the same yielding surface that seemed to breathe beneath her feet. The air grew colder with each stride, her breath puffing out in faint white clouds. Behind her, she felt the weight of its presence growing heavier, closer. The whispers returned, overlapping now, a chorus of voices both familiar and foreign. You opened the door. You let us in. You let me in. Her mind reeled as faces from her past flickered in her vision. Her mother's worried expression as a child, her own reflection in the neighbor's window, and always, always, the pale face behind the glass. She stumbled as pain flared in her head, pressing her palms to her temples. The walls ahead seemed to ripple, and for a moment she thought she saw hands reaching out to her. She broke into a run, her feet slipping on the slick floor, as the hallway twisted and turned like a living thing. The whispers grew louder with every step. "You can't run. You never could." Her chest burned, her legs ached, but still she ran, desperate for an exit, a door, anything. Then she saw it, a faint square of light at the end of the corridor. Hope surged in her chest as she pushed harder, her hands outstretched. But as she neared it, her stomach dropped. The light wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from a window, her own bedroom window. She skidded to a halt, staring in horror. Through the glass, she saw herself, standing motionless in her room, eyes blank, mouth slightly open. Behind her, the figure loomed, its long fingers brushing her hair. And then, as if sensing her gaze, the version of herself in the window turned, slowly, unnaturally, to stare directly at her. Her scream caught in her throat as hands shot out from the walls, grabbing her arms, her legs, her throat. Cold, clammy fingers dug into her skin as the faces pressed closer, their open mouths whispering frantically, "Don't look, don't see." But it was too late. The figure in the window stepped forward, its featureless face filling the glass until it blotted out everything else. Tap, tap, tap. The sound vibrated through her skull as her vision blurred. The last thing she felt before the darkness claimed her was the cold press of fingers against her eyelids. She woke again to darkness, but this time it wasn't quiet. The sound of tapping filled the air around her, not gentle or hesitant, but sharp and insistent, as though hundreds of knuckles pounded on hundreds of unseen doors at once. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was maddening, growing faster with each passing second until it felt like it was inside her skull, rattling her brain against her skull. She clutched her head and curled into herself, tears welling in her eyes. "Stop," she whispered hoarsely. "Please stop." But the sound only grew louder, accompanied now by soft, sibilant whispers that overlapped and tangled into words she couldn't understand. Her body felt stiff, her limbs heavy, as though weighed down by invisible hands. She forced herself to sit up, her movements sluggish and unsteady. The room around her was different this time, smaller, tighter, the walls pressed so close she could touch both sides if she stretched out her arms. Faces still peered out from the surfaces, their lips moving in silent screams. A faint glow pulsed from the walls, veins of light running like cracks through old plaster. She followed them with her eyes until they converged at a single point directly above her head. Slowly, she tilted her gaze upward and froze. The figure was there, not hanging this time, but crouched against the ceiling like a grotesque insect, its long limbs splayed out at impossible angles. Its featureless face pointed straight down at her, and though it had no eyes, she felt its gaze as a physical weight pressing down on her chest. "We're so close now," it whispered, its voice vibrating in her bones. "You've already crossed the threshold. You've always belonged here." She shook her head violently, scrambling backward until her shoulders pressed into the cold wall. Her breathing came fast and shallow as she tried to push herself to her feet. The floor beneath her pulsed like a living thing, each beat matching the frantic pounding of her own heart. Tap, tap, tap. She staggered forward, her bare feet sticking slightly with every step, as though the surface were coated in a thin layer of warm tar. The air smelled worse here, damp, metallic and faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. The whispers grew louder, circling her in dizzying spirals. "Where do you think you're going?" the voice asked. Not curious, but amused, like a predator indulging a cornered animal. She ignored it, focusing instead on a faint outline ahead. A door. Unlike the other surfaces in this place, it wasn't covered in faces. It was smooth, featureless, and glowing faintly from within. Her chest tightened with both fear and hope. Maybe this was the way out. She pushed herself into a run, each step sticky and awkward, but the door didn't seem to get any closer. No matter how fast she moved, the distance never closed. She screamed in frustration, her voice raw and ragged, echoing weirdly off the walls. The figure's laughter followed, low and rattling. "You still think there's a door. You still think there's an outside." Its voice seemed to slither directly into her ears. "But you never left. You never will. You're part of this now." Hands shot out from the walls as she passed, clawing at her arms and legs. She screamed again, kicking wildly as cold, clammy fingers wrapped around her ankles, her wrists. She stumbled and fell, her body slamming hard against the slick floor. Pain shot up her spine as she tried to crawl, but the hands only tightened, dragging her backward inch by inch. She clawed at the floor, nails tearing against the soft, pulsing surface. Ahead, the door flickered faintly like a dying light bulb. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. She sobbed in despair as the hands pulled her into the wall itself. Her body sank slowly into the surface, the soft, yielding material closing over her legs, her waist, her chest. Faces pressed close, their blank eyes and silent mouths moving just beyond the thin membrane that now encased her. She could feel their breath against her skin, cold and clammy. "Don't fight," they whispered in unison. "It's easier if you don't fight." Her arms were pinned now, her struggles growing weaker as exhaustion spread through her like a poison. The figure's voice hummed in her mind, soothing and terrible all at once. "This is where you've always belonged." Behind the glass, watched. She felt the last of her strength slipping away as her face sank beneath the surface. Darkness swallowed her completely, and for a moment, she felt nothing. Then, light, blinding, cold, unnatural. She opened her eyes to find herself standing outside again. Her house loomed before her, its windows dark, its walls silent. For a brief, fragile moment, she thought she was free. But as she turned to run, her body refused to obey. Her feet remained planted, her arms slack at her sides. Panic flared in her chest as she realized she couldn't even turn her head. She was frozen, trapped, and then she saw it in the window of her neighbor's house across the street. Tall, thin, motionless, watching her. Her breath hitched as she recognized the hollow, featureless face. But it wasn't alone. Slowly, it raised its hand, pressing its palm flat against the glass. And from the black depths where its eyes should have been, another face appeared. She couldn't look away. Her own face stared back at her from the black depths of the figure's hollow eyes. But it wasn't her as she was now. It was different. The face in the window was pale and slack, its mouth slightly open as if caught mid-breath. The eyes were glassy and lifeless, reflecting nothing of the panic tearing through her chest. She tried to scream, to move, to do anything to break free from the invisible force holding her still, but her body wouldn't obey. Behind the figure, the faint glow of the neighbor's house flickered like a dying ember. The voice came again, softer now, almost tender. "You see yourself because you've always been here, watched." Her mind reeled as the words echoed endlessly in her skull. Her throat tightened until it hurt to breathe, her heart pounding in her ears with a rhythm that matched the sound. Tap, tap, tap. Except now it wasn't coming from the outside. It wasn't even in her head anymore. It was in her chest. Every heartbeat was a knock, hammering against her ribcage from the inside. The figure raised its other hand and pressed it to the glass, its long fingers splayed wide. She felt it then, a cold, magnetic pull deep within her sternum, as if invisible strings connected her body to the thing behind the window. Slowly, her own hands rose without her command. Her palms pressed flat against her chest, directly over her thundering heart. She sobbed in terror, her tears blurring the figure's shape, but no sound escaped her lips. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they formed a thick, suffocating chorus. It's time to join. You've knocked long enough. Now, open. Pain exploded in her chest, sharp and sudden, as if fingers of ice were prying her ribs apart. Her vision swam violently, the edges darkening as the world tilted and twisted, and still, she couldn't scream. She could only watch as cracks began to form across her reflection's pale face, thin black lines, spiderwebbing outward from the glassy eyes. The cracks deepened until the face began to split, chunks falling away like broken porcelain. Behind it was not blood or bone, but an endless darkness alive with movement. Countless pale hands reached outward, their spindly fingers twitching eagerly. Her stomach lurched as one hand pressed flat against the inside of the glass, followed by another and another. Soon there were too many to count, writhing and clawing as though desperate to break free. The figure stepped back, its hollow face tilting slightly, as though admiring its work. You called us, it whispered, again and again. Each knock opened another door. She shook her head violently, trying to deny it, but deep down she knew it was true. She remembered nights as a child hearing faint taps in the walls, ignoring them until they grew louder. Mornings spent staring at her neighbor's empty house, certain she'd seen movement in the windows, and more recently, the persistent knocking in her home she'd blamed on pipes, on wind, on anything but this. She had called them, she had let them in. The glass of the neighbor's window began to buckle outward, distorting like stretched plastic. The hands pushed harder now, small faces pressing close behind them, featureless, eyeless, screaming silently. Her chest heaved as a sharp pressure built behind her eyes. Something was coming through, not from the outside, but from her. She felt her skin tighten, her ribs strain, as if her own body were becoming the vessel for whatever had waited so long. Don't fight, the chorus whispered. You're almost ready, almost. Her fingers curled involuntarily, digging into her own chest until her nails broke the skin. Warmth spread under her palms, her blood, but even that felt wrong, thick and cold like oil. She tried to scream again, but only a choked sob escaped. Slowly her reflection in the window began to move independently, its head tilting at a sickening angle before its mouth opened impossibly wide. From the darkness inside, a single voice spoke. Let us through. The sound shattered something deep in her mind. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the asphalt, her body convulsing violently. The pain in her chest grew unbearable, each heartbeat pounding like a sledgehammer. She felt her mouth opening without her will, a low, guttural sound tearing free from her throat. Her jaw stretched wider, wider, far beyond what was natural. The sound grew louder, a warped echo of her own scream mingling with the chorus of whisper. Her eyes rolled back as tears streamed down her face. She could feel them now, the hands not outside but inside her, fingers dragging themselves up her throat, scraping the soft flesh, reaching for her mouth. She gagged violently as cold, spindly digits pried open her lips from within. The chorus screamed in delight. Yes, 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 open, open. Then with a sudden snap it stopped. The air went still, the sound vanishing so abruptly it felt like her eardrums had ruptured. She lay gasping on the cold asphalt, her body trembling violently. For a long, terrible moment, there was nothing but her own ragged breathing. Then she heard it again, faint, deliberate, tap, tap, tap. Her head jerked up toward the sound. The figure stood directly in front of her now, towering and still, its face level with hers even as it loomed impossibly tall. Slowly it crouched until its smooth, hollow face hovered inches from her own. She could feel the cold radiating off it, seeping deep into her bones. Its hand reached out, a single long finger pressing gently against her forehead. "You're ready," it whispered. "Now, knock." The finger on her forehead felt colder than anything she'd ever known. It wasn't the chill of winter or ice. It was the absence of heat, the sucking void of a place where warmth had never existed. Her skin prickled beneath it, as though her body recognized the touch before her mind could comprehend it. Slowly, the figure's hand began to push, not hard, but with a pressure that seemed to seep past her skin and into her skull. She tried to pull away, but her body wouldn't move. Even her thoughts felt sluggish, drowning in a thick fog that dulled her panic. "You've seen enough from the outside," the voice whispered, low and resonant. "It's time to see from within." A sharp, stabbing pain flared in her head as a sound, wet and cracking, filled her ears. It was her own skull, she realized with horror, yielding under the invisible pressure. She felt something shift inside her, a sickening pop that sent hot tears streaking down her face. Her vision blurred as the world tilted wildly, the street and houses bending and folding like paper. The ground beneath her buckled, swallowing her legs, her waist, her chest. Her hands clawed at the asphalt, but her fingers found no grip, only a cold, slick surface that pulsed faintly under her touch. She was being dragged down, inch by inch, as though the earth itself had become alive. The figure's face loomed closer, its hollow eyes boring into hers, and in those pits of darkness, she saw movement, tiny, writhing forms pressed against the invisible barrier, their pale hands and eyeless faces peering back at her. "We've waited," the chorus whispered from everywhere and nowhere. "For you." For the door. Her mouth opened in a silent scream as the last of her body slipped beneath the surface, the cold swallowing her whole. Darkness closed around her, thick and absolute. She floated in the void, weightless yet crushed on all sides by an unseen force. Then, faintly, a sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was slower now, almost gentle, as though someone rapped softly on a door. "Where do you think you are?" the voice asked. It wasn't the same layered whisper as before. This one was clear, singular, almost human. She opened her mouth to answer, but found no voice. "You're home," it said. Light bloomed faintly in the blackness, and she realized she was standing again. The floor beneath her feet was familiar, hardwood, slightly scuffed near the corners. The air smelled faintly of coffee and laundry detergent. She was in her own house, but something was wrong. The walls seemed too close, the shadows too deep, and in every reflective surface, the windows, the TV screen, even the sheen on the wooden floor, she saw it. The figure, watching, always watching. A faint knock echoed from the front door. She turned toward it, her breath catching in her throat. Another knock, louder this time. Tap, 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 tap. Her feet moved on their own, carrying her down the hallway, despite every instinct screaming to turn back. As she neared the door, the knocking stopped. Silence pressed in, heavy and expectant. Her hand rose, trembling, and grasped the knob. She didn't want to open it. She knew what waited on the other side, but her fingers twisted the metal anyway. The door swung inward with a faint creak. Nothing stood there, only darkness, and yet she felt the presence. "You invited us," the voice whispered from the void beyond. "You saw us, you let us in." She tried to slam the door, but invisible hands shot out from the shadows, gripping her wrists. Cold fingers wrapped around her throat, her ankles, her chest. Now the voice said, "You knock." Pain bloomed in her chest as her hands slammed, hard and unrelenting, against her own ribcage. Tap, tap, tap. Each impact reverberated through her bones like a drumbeat. She gasped as her vision warped again, the walls folding inward, the ceiling dropping lower. The house seemed to pulse around her like a living organism. She stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet, but the hands didn't let go. They yanked her forward until she slammed into the mirror by her front door. Her reflection stared back at her, pale, wide-eyed, mouth open in a silent plea for help. Behind it, the figure rose, impossibly tall, its featureless face pressed close to the glass. Slowly, it raised one hand and knocked on the inside of the mirror. Tap, tap, tap. She felt the sound vibrate in her skull, in her chest, in her very teeth. And then her reflection smiled, a slow, unnatural stretch of lips and teeth. The figure leaned closer, its voice a guttural rasp that made her skin crawl. "You're already on the other side." Her mouth opened to scream, but no sound came. Instead, a cold wind rushed into her lungs, filling her with the stench of damp earth and decay. The figure's fingers brushed her reflection's cheek, and she felt it on her own skin, cold and wrong. "You've seen what waits in the dark," it whispered. "Now, stay." Her reflection pressed its hand to the glass. The skin of her palm burned as she felt the pressure from within, a perfect match. Slowly, her reflection began to sink into the mirror, dragging her with it. She fought wildly, kicking and clawing, but the pull was too strong. Her body pressed flat against the glass as the whispers swelled into a deafening chorus. Knock, knock, knock. The last thing she saw before her face vanished into the mirror was the neighbor's house across the street. Its windows glowed faintly, and in one of them, a figure watched. Not the tall, pale thing this time, but a woman, her pale, wide-eyed, and smiling. The first thing she noticed was the sound. Not the faint knocking she had grown used to, but a low, wet sound, like the house itself was breathing, labored, shallow, and unsteady. She opened her eyes to find herself lying on the floor, the wooden boards beneath her slick with moisture. The air was thick and humid, carrying the heavy scent of mold and decay. For a moment, she couldn't remember how she had gotten here. Then it came flooding back. The neighbor's house, the figure, the mirror. Her stomach twisted violently as she scrambled to her feet, her hands slipping against the damp boards. The room around her was familiar and wrong all at once. The furniture was her own, but warped, twisted as though softened by heat, and then allowed to harden in strange, unnatural shapes. The walls pulsed faintly, stretching and contracting like lungs struggling to draw breath. She pressed her hands to her ears as the sound grew louder, more insistent. Each breath seemed to vibrate through her ribs, her skull, her very teeth. A faint voice echoed through the house, so low she could barely make out the words. Still running. It wasn't a question, still pretending there's an outside. Her pulse quickened as she stumbled toward the door, her bare feet squelching slightly against the floor. When she tried the knob, it twisted easily, but the door opened only to reveal another room identical to the one she had just left. Same warped furniture, same breathing walls, same oppressive darkness in the corners. She slammed it shut and turned to try another door, but the result was the same. No matter which exit she chose, she found herself back where she started. Panic clawed up her throat as she realized the house had folded in on itself, trapping her in a looping maze of her own making. "There is no leaving," the voice murmured. "Closer now. You've been here far longer than you remember." She backed away from the latest door, her hands trembling violently. The air around her seemed to thicken, pressing in on her lungs until each breath came shallow and ragged. Faces began to emerge faintly in the walls, their features distorted and blurred as though seen through murky water. Eyes opened blank and unblinking, following her every movement. "You were curious once," the voice continued, almost tender now. "You looked when others didn't. You listened when others ignored. And with every glance, every strained ear, you made the knocking louder." She shook her head violently, her tears blinding her as she stumbled into yet another room. This one was slightly different, the walls cracked in places, with thin rivulets of dark liquid oozing from the seams. The sound of breathing was louder here, wetter, as though something just beyond the walls was gasping in excitement. Her hands clutched her head as memories flashed behind her eyes, glimpses of herself as a child, standing frozen at her bedroom window, convinced she saw movement in the neighbor's dark house. Nights as a teenager when she pressed her ear to the walls, hearing faint tapping, she convinced herself was pipes or wind. And then as an adult, the first night she heard knocking after her neighbors left for vacation. Each memory hit like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. "You've always been with us," the voice whispered. "Every night, every knock, we've been here, waiting for the door to open." She sobbed violently, her body racked with shivers as she pressed herself against the nearest wall. But instead of solid wood, her back met something soft and yielding, like flesh. She recoiled instantly, but it was too late. The wall pulsed under her hands, and from within, faint fingers began pressing outward, leaving shallow indentations in the surface. She stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet and falling hard onto the warped floor. Her vision swam as the walls began to shift, their surfaces rippling like water. The faces became clearer now, hundreds of them packed tightly together, their eyes wide and glassy, their mouths open in frozen screams. She realized with dawning horror that she recognized some of them, her neighbors, people she had passed on the street, a childhood friend she hadn't seen in years, all of them staring out at her, their silent pleas for help filling her with suffocating dread. "We all knocked once," they whispered in unison, their voices hollow and layered. "We all let them in." The chorus grew louder, deafening, until it was all she could hear. She pressed her hands over her ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. The air shifted suddenly, and she felt it before she saw it. The figure, it emerged from the far wall, its pale body stretching unnaturally as it pulled itself free of the surface. Its featureless face turned toward her, and she felt its gaze, like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. "No more running," it said softly, No more doors, only walls now. It stepped closer, the floor groaning under its weight. Each step it took seemed to make the room smaller, the walls pressing inward with a faint, wet sound. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she scrambled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The room had shrunk to a narrow corridor, barely wide enough to fit her. The figure's long fingers grazed the ceiling, the floor, the walls as it moved, its voice a low hum that made her teeth ache. "You'll feel better soon," it promised, "once you stop trying to leave." She pressed her back against the narrowing corridor, her lungs screaming for air as the walls inched closer, the breathing of the house growing louder, heavier. Every exhale seemed to coat her skin in a cold, sticky dampness, like condensation from something alive and waiting. The figure loomed at the far end, its head tilting slightly, as though studying her terror. Its elongated fingers scraped along the walls with a faint, grating sound that set her teeth on edge. "This is the moment you stop pretending," the voice whispered. "You've clung to the idea of escape, but even now you feel it, don't you? The pull." She swallowed hard, her throat dry and burning. The pull was there deep in her chest, tugging her forward as though an invisible thread had been sewn directly into her heart. Her hands clawed uselessly at the slick walls, but they offered no grip, only a cold, quivering resistance that pulsed faintly beneath her fingers. Her mind reeled as she thought back to the door she had opened, the glass she had stared through, and the sound, always the sound. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't coming from outside. It had never been outside. It had been in her all along, growing louder, with every glance at the neighbor's house, every night spent listening to faint sounds in her own walls. "You're the door," the voice said, closer now, impossibly intimate. "You've always been the door." She shook her head violently, tears streaking down her face as her knees buckled. "No," she whispered, though her voice cracked under the weight of the word. The figure didn't stop. It stepped closer, and with each movement the walls seemed to breathe faster, exhaling humid air that smelled of rot and soil. The faces in the walls pressed closer too, their blank eyes following her with desperate hunger. Suddenly, hands burst from the walls, hundreds of them pale and twitching, their long fingers grasping for her skin, her hair, her clothes. She screamed, her body thrashing wildly as the cold fingers dug into her arms and legs, yanking her forward. "Don't fight," the chorus of whispers said, their voices layered and endless. "You'll only make it hurt." She kicked out, her bare foot connecting with one of the grasping hands, but it didn't recoil. Instead, it clamped down harder, pulling her closer to the waiting figure. The corridor seemed to elongate with every step, the distance between her and the thing growing even as she was dragged forward. Her nails tore at the walls, breaking against the soft, pulsing surface until her fingers were slick with blood. But still, she was dragged on. The figure crouched low as she neared, its smooth, featureless face tilting until it hovered inches from her own. She could feel the cold radiating off it, a chill so deep it seemed to seep directly into her bones. "Open," it whispered. The word vibrated through her chest, her ribs aching with the force of it. Her mouth opened involuntarily, and a low, guttural sound emerged, a sound that wasn't entirely her own. She felt it then, a twisting in her gut, a writhing movement under her skin. Something was inside her, not growing, waiting. The hands tightened their grip as the figure reached out, its long fingers brushing her cheek with a gentleness that was somehow worse than violence. "It's time," it said softly, "time to let them out." Her body convulsed violently, as an intense pressure built behind her sternum. She could feel them now, tiny fingers dragging themselves up her throat, scraping at the delicate flesh from within. She gagged, her eyes bulging as cold air rushed into her lungs, in short, ragged gasps. The faces in the walls screamed silently, as one, their mouths stretching impossibly wide in perfect unison. "Don't hold it in," the chorus begged. "We're waiting." Her knees hit the floor hard, as her body shook uncontrollably. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth as her jaw wrenched open, far wider than it should have. And in the silence that followed, she felt it, her first knock. It reverberated through her chest, with a force that rattled her teeth. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was deafening, not coming from the walls this time, but from her. She gasped as the force of it arched her back painfully, her fingernails clawing at the floor. Another knock, harder now. Tap, 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 tap. The figure leaned closer, its hollow face inches from her own. "Yes," it whispered. "You're ready." Her vision blurred as tears and sweat mingled, dripping onto the floor beneath her. But as the sound grew louder, more insistent, a terrible realization clawed its way to the surface of her mind. She wasn't knocking, she was being knocked on from the inside. The pressure intensified until her ribs ached, as though they might snap. She screamed, but the sound warped into a low, resonant hum that filled the corridor. The hands in the walls pulled harder, dragging her forward, until she was pressed flat against the figure's cold, smooth chest. Its long fingers curled around her head, cradling her like a child. "She'd," it whispered. "This is the last threshold." The knocking grew frantic, pounding at her insides like a trapped animal. Tap, 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 until finally, with a sickening crack, something inside her gave way. The crack echoed through the house, like a gunshot. She felt it deep in her ribs, the splintering pain sharp and cold, as her chest seemed to cave inward, then balloon outward unnaturally. Her scream caught in her throat, choked off by the sudden weight pressing up from her lungs. It wasn't breath, it was movement, slithering, writhing, a swarm of cold fingers dragging themselves through her veins, clawing toward her throat. Her mouth stretched wider still, her jaw aching as though it might snap from the strain. The figure's hands cradled her skull with grotesque tenderness, its voice a low hum in her mind. "Beautiful," it said. "So long we've waited for a door to open this wide." The faces in the walls were shrieking now, their mouths moving in silent terror, as pale hands began to reach out from their eyes, their nostrils, their gaping mouths. She could feel their despair mingling with her own as she thrashed weakly against the figure's hold. But her body wasn't her own anymore. She could barely control the quivering of her fingers, let alone stop the thing clawing up her throat. The sound came again. Tap, tap. This time so loud it vibrated her teeth. It was frantic now, not a polite knock, but a pounding demand for release. Her vision swam violently, and the warped corridor around her seemed to pulse in rhythm with the sound. Each knock made the walls bulge outward, slick with condensation and streaked with black veins. The hands that had dragged her here were pulling back now, retreating into the walls, as if even they feared what was coming. The house groaned like a living creature in pain, its breathing ragged and uneven. "It's too late," the figure whispered. "You can't hold them any longer. You were never meant to." Its fingers traced her temple almost lovingly. "You've done well, so very well, but doors must open." Her body convulsed violently as her stomach lurched, bile rising in her throat. She gagged, choking as a thin, cold tendril pressed against the back of her teeth. Her reflection appeared suddenly on the corridor's slick wall, pale, wild-eyed lips stretched too wide. But something about it was wrong. It wasn't mirroring her anymore. Instead, it grinned with a manic joy that made her blood run cold. In the reflection's chest, faint movements squirmed just beneath the skin, hundreds of tiny bulges pressing outward like worms in soft earth. The reflection raised its hand and placed it against the surface of the wall. "Knock," it mouthed silently. "Knock." She shook her head violently, her hands clawing at her throat, as if she could somehow stop what was rising within her. But the figure's grip tightened, and her reflection's grin only widened until its mouth split impossibly from ear to ear. From the yawning darkness inside, she could see them, pale faces, eyeless, and screaming silently as they pressed forward. A cold whisper brushed her mind. "You're next." Her chest heaved as her ribs spread wider with a sickening pop. The tendril in her throat thickened, forcing her jaw open even further. Blood trickled down her chin as tears streamed from her eyes. The pounding was deafening now, each knock a physical force that rattled her bones. Tap, tap, until her entire body vibrated like a struck bell. She tried to scream, but only a wet, gurgling sound escaped. The figure leaned closer, its smooth face mere inches from hers. "Open," it commanded. The walls of the corridor began to split, deep cracks spiderwebbing outward as black ichor seeped from them in thick, oily rivulets. The faces in the walls screamed wordlessly as they were pulled back into the darkness, their hands scrabbling for purchase before vanishing entirely. The corridor was collapsing, folding inward like a mouth preparing to swallow her whole. She felt it finally, the first hand. Cold, wet fingers curled around her tongue from within, prying at her teeth. Another hand joined it, then another, until it felt like dozens of them fought to drag themselves out of her. She choked, gagging violently as her vision blurred with tears. Her body jerked uncontrollably, her heels drumming against the floor as the sound grew louder still. Tap, tap, tap. The figure's voice grew almost tender, its fingers stroking her hair as it spoke. "Don't fight them, they've waited so long." The hands in her mouth pressed harder, and with one final shuddering gasp, her jaw gave way. A pale, featureless head forced its way out, slick with blood and saliva, its eyeless face turning toward her before a thin, reedy scream tore from its open mouth. The corridor exploded into noise and movement as dozens, no hundreds of figures began pouring from her mouth and chest. They clawed their way free, their long limbs unfolding awkwardly as they tumbled to the floor. The air filled with a deafening chorus of whispers and screams as the creatures spread out, their pale bodies writhing over each other like a nest of maggots disturbed. She collapsed to the floor, her body trembling violently, blood streaming from her mouth and nose. Her vision dimmed as she watched them crawl into the walls, the cracks widening to swallow them one by one. The figure released her at last, standing tall as its smooth face turned to watch its children scurry away. "It's done," it whispered. "You've opened the door." The house fell silent. After the last of them disappeared into the walls, only the sound of her own ragged breathing filled the suffocating air, each inhale burning her throat like acid. She lay sprawled on the warped floor, her body trembling with exhaustion, blood pooling beneath her where her jaw hung slack, stretched and fractured from the horrors it had unleashed. Her fingers twitched weakly, sticky with the dark ichor that coated her skin. She wanted to move, to crawl away, to find some corner untouched by the pale creatures that had poured from her like a dam bursting. But her limbs felt heavy, her muscles refusing to respond. Above her, the figure remained still, its head tilted as though admiring its work. The air around it seemed to thrum faintly, vibrating with an energy that made her teeth ache. Slowly, it crouched low until its featureless face hovered inches from hers. "Do you feel it?" it whispered. "The house breathes because you do. You're part of it now." A low groan echoed through the walls, the sound of wood straining and nails popping as the house began to shift again. The floor beneath her pulsed faintly, matching the rhythm of her own slowing heartbeat. She realized with dawning horror that the house wasn't just alive, it was her. Or rather, she was it. The boundaries between her body and the structure blurred with each labored breath. She could feel it all now, the scurrying of pale figures in unseen spaces, the cold, damp air filling narrow corridors, the faint warmth of countless faces pressed against thin walls. Her stomach turned violently as her mind processed the sensations, too much for a single body to hold. "You've given them passage," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant. "You're no longer just a door, you're the hallways, the rooms, the foundation." Her mouth opened in a silent scream as her vision warped again. The walls began to ripple like water, their surfaces bulging outward in places as pale hands pressed against them from within. Eyeless faces peered out, their mouths opening and closing silently, as though testing their newfound freedom. Slowly, cracks spread across the ceiling, thin and jagged like veins. From these fractures oozed a dark, tar-like liquid that dripped steadily onto the floor, pooling around her in thick puddles. The air grew heavier still, the scent of rot and wet soil suffocating in its intensity. "They're settling in," the figure whispered, its hands brushing her blood-matted hair. "It's been so long since the house was full." A faint sound rose in the distance, soft at first, then growing louder. Tap, 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 the knocking. But now it came from everywhere, inside the walls, beneath the floorboards, even within her own chest. She tried to scream again, but only a weak, rasping sound escaped her torn throat. The figure's hand cupped her cheek gently. "Don't be afraid," it said. "The first breaths are always the hardest." A sudden, sharp pain lanced through her skull, as memories not her own began to flood her mind. She saw flashes of other lives, strangers standing in doorways, their eyes wide as pale figures crowded behind them, children crying in dark rooms as the sound of knocking grew louder, neighbors watching helplessly from across the street as windows warped and walls trembled. Each vision came with a wave of despair so intense, it left her gasping. She realized with mounting dread that these weren't just memories, they were warnings. All the people who had seen the signs, all of them now part of the house. The walls shuddered violently as more creatures forced their way through cracks, their long limbs unfolding like spiders as they tumbled onto the floor. They moved awkwardly at first, their pale bodies twitching with unnatural energy, but soon they found their rhythm. Some crawled up the walls, their fingers leaving faint trails in the pulsing surface. Others disappeared into shadowy corners, their whispers mingling with the chorus that now echoed through every room. "Home," they chanted. "Home." The sound rose in intensity until it vibrated in her bones, her teeth rattling from the force of it. She pressed her hands to her ears, but it did nothing to block out the noise. Her reflection appeared again in the slick surface of the floor, pale, gaunt, its wide eyes full of something she couldn't name. It smiled. A sudden jolt rocked the house, the floor tilting sharply, as though some great weight had shifted beneath it. She screamed as she slid across the slick surface, her fingers clawing desperately for purchase. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, impossibly tall and still, its featureless face watching her struggle. "The foundation is strong now," it murmured. "You're strong now." Her back slammed into a wall with bruising force, knocking the air from her lungs. The surface beneath her pulsed again, softening until it seemed to mold around her body like a second skin. She tried to push herself free, but the wall clung tightly, pulling her in inch by inch. The faces pressed closer, their mouths moving in silent screams as they watched her disappear. Her last sight, before the darkness claimed her, was the figure stepping closer, its head tilting as it pressed its hand against the spot where her face met the wall. "Shh," it whispered. "Sleep now. We'll take care of the knocking." The world dimmed to nothing, the sound of 100 pale hands tapping faintly all around her. Tap, tap, tap. The first sensation was warmth, not the gentle heat of sunlight or the comforting press of a blanket, but a cloying, suffocating warmth that seeped into her skin like fever. She tried to move, but her body was unresponsive, pinned in place by a weight that felt both physical and intangible. Her eyelids fluttered open to reveal darkness, so absolute it seemed to have depth, layers upon layers of black pressing in from every side. She wasn't lying on a floor anymore. She wasn't lying anywhere. The house was gone, or perhaps it had never been a house at all. Slowly, sound returned, a faint, rhythmic tapping that grew louder with each passing second. Tap, tap, tap. The noise vibrated through her ribs, her skull, until it became impossible to tell where it originated. Was it outside, inside, or simply her own heartbeat, transformed into that dreadful sound? "Awake," said a voice, not a whisper this time, but a deep, resonant tone that filled the darkness. "Good." She tried to speak, but her throat burned raw, her tongue heavy and swollen in her mouth. A pale glow flared in the distance, revealing faint outlines of walls. They were closer now, pressing in until the narrow space barely left room to breathe. The glow pulsed like a living thing, in rhythm with the tapping sound. "Do you feel it?" the voice continued. "The house no longer needs to knock. You've given it shape. It's yours, and you are its." She shook her head weakly, her tears hot against her skin. "I'm not," she croaked, though her voice was little more than a rasp. The walls responded with a low groan that set her teeth on edge. Cracks spread across their surfaces, black ichor seeping from the seams like sweat. "Lies," the voice boomed. "You've always been here. You were built for this." The glow intensified until she could see the outlines of the space more clearly. It was no longer her house. Not exactly, but a grotesque imitation. The furniture was twisted and wrong, the walls alive with faint, pulsing veins that throbbed in time with her heartbeat. Faces pressed against the surfaces, their eyes blank and unblinking, mouths opening and closing soundlessly. One by one, they began to speak, not aloud, but directly into her mind. "You let us in. You made the choice. You're the reason we're here." Their voices overlapped in a suffocating chorus that drowned out her own thoughts. She pressed her hands to her ears, but it did nothing to silence them. The glow brightened further, revealing a single figure standing in the corner. It was taller than before, its featureless face now faintly reflective, like polished glass. Slowly, it raised one long arm and pointed at her. "Time to finish," it said. "Time to give us what's owed." Her stomach churned violently as she stumbled back, her shoulders pressing into the soft, pulsing wall. "I don't understand," she whispered. The figure tilted its head, and the air thickened around her, heavy with an almost metallic taste. The house is full now, it said. It's alive because of you, but it's still hungry. The tapping resumed, louder this time, coming from all directions. Tap, tap, tap. They want out, the voice continued. But out is not enough. A house cannot stand without an anchor. You are that anchor. The walls began to close in, forcing her forward toward the figure. She shook her head violently, her tears blinding her as her breath came in ragged gasps. No, she croaked. Please, I can't. The figure's reflective face seemed to ripple as countless pale hands pressed against its surface from within. You can, it said, or you can bring someone else. The word struck her like a physical blow. Someone else. A flicker of memory surfaced, her neighbors' smiling faces as they waved goodbye, suitcases in hand, unaware of what lurked in their home. She thought of her sister, who had called days ago, worried after hearing nothing for weeks. You have a choice, the voice said. Stay, become one with us, or knock for another. The faces in the walls leaned closer, their mouths stretched into grotesque smiles. Knock for another, they whispered in unison. Knock, knock. Her stomach lurched as bile rose in her throat. Could she really? Could she damn someone else to this? She thought of her sister again, her warm laughter, her gentle voice. Then she thought of the figure's hand on her chest, its cold fingers brushing her skin as it whispered. The house must be fed. The walls pressed closer still, until there was no space left between her and the figure. Its long fingers cupped her face, tilting her head upward, until her eyes met its reflective surface. And there, deep in the black glass, she saw herself, not as she was now, but as she would be, pale, hollow-eyed, her mouth stretching open in a silent, eternal scream, as the house consumed her piece by piece. Behind her reflection, countless pale figures writhed, their hollow eyes fixed on her as they whispered her name. Decide, the figure said softly. All will decide for you. A sudden sharp pain flared in her chest as the knocking grew deafening, pounding against her ribs, with enough force to lift her off the floor slightly. Tap, tap, tap. She gasped, her tears streaming as her hands clutched her chest. The choice was hers, but not for long. The walls pressed closer, their pulsing surfaces so near now she could feel them against her skin. Each throb like the faint beat of a massive, sickly heart. She gasped as the figure's cold hands slid to her shoulders, its touch seeping deep into her bones like frost. You've heard the knocking long enough to know, it whispered. It was never coming from outside. The words wrapped around her mind, tightening like a noose. Faces in the walls stared with hollow devotion, their mouths working soundlessly until they spoke as one. Choose. The tapping returned. Louder now. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't just in her chest anymore. It echoed in her skull, her teeth vibrating with each strike. Her knees buckled as she pressed her hands over her ears, desperate to shut out the sound, but the knocking only grew louder. You can't keep them waiting, the figure murmured, its voice low and strangely tender. Choose, or the house will take everything. Her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as images flickered in her mind, her sister's face smiling warmly as they shared coffee just weeks ago. Her elderly neighbor, always offering a cheerful wave as he watered his plants. Strangers passing her house every day, unaware of what waited behind her walls. The figure leaned closer, its smooth face mere inches from hers. A house needs residents, it whispered. You've given us so many already. But one more, one last anchor, and you can leave. Her stomach twisted violently as bile rose in her throat. Could she? Could she point to someone else? Anyone else? And damn them to this. Her body shook as the thought clawed at her mind. She was no longer sure whether the tears streaming down her cheeks were from horror or temptation. The knocking pounded harder. Tap, tap, tap. Each strike sent a sharp stabbing pain through her ribs, as though something inside her demanded to be released. Her lips trembled as her voice finally emerged, cracked and hoarse. I can't, she whispered, but the figure's cold fingers pressed against her lips, silencing her. You can, it murmured. Everyone does. The walls groaned in agreement, the faces pressing closer, their empty eyes glowing faintly now with an unnatural light. Give us another, they whispered. Or stay, stay, stay. Her hands clutched her head as the images in her mind grew clearer. She saw her sister sitting at her kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. She saw her neighbor locking his door for the last time, unaware of the eyes watching from her windows. The temptation grew like a cancer in her chest. Just one person for her freedom. But even as the thought rooted itself, a deep, instinctive revulsion tore through her. Could she really condemn someone else to this? To the cold, the suffocating walls, the pale hands clawing from within. She remembered the horror of being dragged into the corridor, the sound of countless bodies scraping against the walls, the endless, echoing whispers. No, she rasped, shaking her head violently. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if curious. No, it repeated. So you'll stay. You'll let the house consume you. The hands in the walls began to reach again, pale and twitching as they clawed for her skin. The knocking grew deafening, a relentless drumbeat that rattled the very air. Tap, tap, tap. Her chest felt like it might explode under the pressure. She fell to her knees, sobbing as the figure loomed above her, its long fingers outstretched. We'll make it quick, it promised. One breath and you'll be part of the walls. You won't even remember you existed. The faces in the walls smiled, their mouths opening wide as they whispered in unison. Stay, stay, stay. Her breath hitched violently as she pressed her forehead to the cold, damp floor. She couldn't bring herself to choose someone else, but she couldn't stay either. She wanted to beg, to plead for another way, but her voice failed her. The figure knelt, its cold hands sliding to her throat. Then let's finish it, it murmured. As its grip tightened, something flickered faintly at the edge of her vision, a small, dim light. She blinked through her tears, her heart lurching, as she realized it wasn't part of the house. It was a street lamp, the neighbor's street lamp. For a split second, she saw the outside world, the sidewalk, the asphalt road, the faint glow of windows across the street. She saw freedom. The figure hesitated as her eyes fixed on the light. You can still go, it whispered. Just knock. Her lips parted, her voice trembling as she whispered, No, I won't. The house shuddered violently at her words, the walls cracking as deafening wails filled the air. The figure's grip became crushing, but still, she did not call for another. The house screamed, not with words, but with a sound so loud and low it seemed to come from the bones of the earth itself. The walls rippled violently, their pale, veined surfaces splitting as hundreds of hands burst outward, clawing at the air in frantic desperation. Faces stretched from the cracking plaster, their mouths gaping wide in silent, agonized shrieks. The figure's grip on her throat, tightened, cold fingers pressing hard enough to cut off her breath. "Stubborn little door," it hissed, its voice no longer tender but sharp and venomous. "Do you think you can defy a house that breathes with your lungs?" Her vision darkened at the edges as her body convulsed, her fingernails raking uselessly at the figure's wrists. She felt her consciousness slipping like sand through grasping fingers, but somewhere deep inside, past the fear and the crushing weight, a flicker of defiance remained. She forced her mouth open, her voice hoarse but steady as she croaked, "I won't knock." The sound wasn't loud, but it reverberated through the house like a strike of lightning. The walls quaked violently, and a high-pitched wail echoed from every corner. The pale faces pressed closer, their mouths twisting in rage as the hands clawed harder at the air. The figure jerked backward slightly, its smooth, reflective face rippling like disturbed water. "You would let yourself rot in these walls," it snarled. "You would deny us our anchor?" She nodded weakly, tears streaming down her face. "Better me than someone else," she whispered. The house shuddered violently, the floor tilting beneath her as cracks spread like spiderwebs across every surface. Black ichor poured from the fissures in great torrents, pooling thickly around her knees. The faces in the walls howled as their features began to melt, their eyes dripping like wax, their mouths collapsing inward in silent horror. "You've doomed them all," the figure hissed, its voice now a chorus of countless voices layered together. "You think your sacrifice ends the hunger? The house will find another. It always does." Its body convulsed violently, splitting down the middle as dozens of pale, grasping hands burst from its chest. They writhed like snakes, clawing at each other as they struggled to break free. "You're nothing," the voices screamed. "A house needs bricks, not sentiment." Her body trembled violently as she pressed her palms to the floor, forcing herself upright despite the crushing weight of the house's rage. The sound of knocking thundered all around her. Tap, 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 each strike so powerful it sent splinters flying from the walls. The air thickened until it felt like she was inhaling syrup, every breath a battle against suffocation. But still, she did not call for another. She staggered to her feet, her knees wobbling as she faced the figure. Its once smooth surface had cracked open now, revealing the writhing mass of pale bodies beneath. Hundreds of hollow eyes turned toward her, their mouths opening in soundless screams. She raised her trembling hands and whispered, "You won't win." The house roared. The sound knocked her backward, her body slamming against the pulsing wall with bruising force. She felt the surface give way behind her, the texture no longer wood or plaster but flesh, hot, quivering flesh that seemed to cling to her skin, as though trying to absorb her whole. Her arms flailed desperately as she was pulled in inch by inch, her legs kicking against the slick floor. "We'll swallow you," the voices hissed. "You'll be one more face in the walls," she screamed as the surface closed over her feet, her calves, her thighs. But even as the darkness crept higher, she spat her defiance through gritted teeth. "I don't care." The house froze. For a split second, the oppressive pressure lifted, and silence fell so thick it felt like a physical weight. The hands withdrew from her skin, retreating into the walls with wet, sucking sounds. The faces melted away, leaving only smooth, pale surfaces. Even the knocking stopped, leaving her chest pounding in the sudden absence of sound. The figure's shattered body slumped forward, its mass of pale limbs twitching weakly, as its many mouths whispered in unison, "We can't hold." Slowly, it began to collapse inward, folding in on itself like a dying star. Black ichor erupted from the seams, spraying the walls as the house groaned one final time. She gasped for air as the walls spat her out, her body landing hard on the cold, warped floor. Her hands shook violently as she pushed herself up, her vision blurry and her ears ringing in the heavy silence. For the first time since stepping into the neighbor's house, she could hear nothing but her own breathing. No whispers, no knocking, nothing. Slowly, she turned her head toward the corridor's end. There, faint and distant, she saw the glow of a window. A real window. The outside world waited on the other side. Dark, quiet, untouched. She staggered toward the faint light, each step heavy as though the floor itself clung to her feet, reluctant to let her go. The silence was unbearable, thick and suffocating after the house's deafening rage. Her breathing sounded too loud, echoing in the empty halls as if mocking her fragile existence. Behind her, the corridor seemed to fold in on itself, the walls contracting and groaning like a dying beast. She didn't look back, couldn't. Every instinct screamed that if she stopped, if she hesitated for even a moment, the house would find the strength to pull her back. The glow grew brighter, sharper, until she could make out the outline of the window frame. Beyond it, the world lay undisturbed. The neighbor's lawn, the quiet street, the faint hum of a distant car engine. Freedom. She pressed a trembling hand to the glass, her fingers leaving streaks of blood as they traced its cold surface. But as she peered out, a faint sound rose behind her. Tap, tap, tap. Her stomach clenched violently, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head. The walls had begun to swell again, faint shapes pressing outward, hands, faces, long limbs. The house was waking. "We're not finished," a chorus of voices whispered, faint yet insistent. "A door is never free. A house must be fed." The figure's cracked remains began to stir, its broken pieces dragging themselves across the floor with wet, scraping sounds. "One more," it rasped, its many voices overlapping in a grotesque harmony. "Give us one more, and we'll let you leave." The knocking grew louder now, reverberating through her chest, her skull. Tap, tap, tap. Her vision blurred with tears as she pressed her forehead to the glass. Her fingers splayed wide, as though willing herself to pass through. Could she do it? Could she damn someone else, anyone else, to this living nightmare? Her mind conjured faces again, her sister laughing over coffee, her neighbor humming as he trimmed his hedges, the mailman whistling as he strolled past the house. All of them blissfully unaware, all of them potential replacements. The house whispered seductively, "It doesn't have to be someone you love. Just knock. A stranger. A name. Any name." She shook her head violently, her tears streaking the glass. "No," she whispered hoarsely. "Not again." The figure rose shakily to its full height, its reflective face rippling with pale, writhing shapes. "Then stay," it said simply. "Anchor us. Forever." She could feel it now, the tendrils creeping back into her chest, wrapping around her ribs, slithering through her veins like roots seeking soil. Her legs buckled as the weight returned, pressing her knees to the cold, slick floor. Faces in the walls grinned as their mouths began to move in unison. "Stay, stay, stay." The glass beneath her hand trembled faintly, a hairline crack forming where her bloody palm pressed hardest. Outside, she saw headlights flash briefly as a car passed, a reminder that the world was still there, that escape was possible. Her heart pounded violently as her other hand curled into a trembling fist. She raised it slowly, poised above the glass. One knock, that's all it would take. A single knock, and someone else would bear this curse, but she couldn't do it. Her fist trembled violently, then fell limp at her side as sobs tore from her raw throat. "I can't," she whispered. "I won't." The house screamed in fury, the walls shaking so violently. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling. Hands burst from every surface, clawing for her arms, her legs, her hair. The figure lunged forward, its long fingers wrapping around her neck. "Then you belong to us," it hissed. The walls surged forward, swallowing the corridor in a wave of pale, pulsing flesh. But as the cold crept up her legs, she slammed her palm against the glass, not in a knock, but in defiance. "No," she screamed, her voice cracking. The glass shattered under her bloody hand, the shards spraying outward as a rush of cold air struck her face. Light poured into the room, blinding and pure. The house recoiled instantly, the hands retreating, the faces vanishing as if burned by the glow. The figure howled in rage as its body convulsed violently, splitting apart into writhing, pale fragments. She felt herself being pulled forward as the light consumed her vision, her body flung through the jagged window frame like a rag doll. When she hit the grass, the silence was absolute. No knocking, no whispers, no breathing walls, just the faint chirp of crickets in the night, and the rustle of a breeze against her torn clothes. She lay there for what felt like hours, staring up at the sky, the stars blurred by tears. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up on shaking arms. The neighbor's house stood dark and silent behind her, its windows blank as eyes that had seen too much. For a moment, it looked normal again, ordinary. But as she stumbled to her feet, she swore she saw faint movement behind the curtains, pale shapes retreating into the shadows. She didn't wait to find out. And that's where the story ends. Or does it? Tonight, the house sleeps. But what if its walls are still listening? What if its whispers are already reaching for someone else? Maybe even you. If you enjoyed unraveling this slow-burning nightmare and want more spine-tingling tales steeped in mystery, darkness, and unsettling truths, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Join us as we dive even deeper into the eerie corners of history, folklore, and true events that will keep you wide awake at night. Turn on notifications so you never miss when the next chilling chapter drops.